Hello, is it working? Yeah, amazing, it's working. Welcome everybody to this event on the Program for Results, an update on the new finance tool of the World Bank. I'm Alan Gelb, I'm a senior fellow at the Centre, and I'd like to welcome you all, and especially, of course, our presenters, Joachim van Ansberg from the World Bank, and our panelists, Paul O'Brien, Simon Bohr, and Bill Savadoff. Bill will be joining us remotely, but nevertheless he will be a presence, I'm sure. And also all the colleagues of Joachim's who have come from the World Bank who've been working on this operation. So you're all very welcome. Many of you will know that the Centre has a very long record of interest in performance-based aid mechanisms, performance-based financing, as part of the interest in aid effectiveness. This has resulted in a couple of books, one on performance-based financing for global health, it was 2009, and also in 2010 on a book on COD, cash on delivery aid. And there have been other papers, and there's been work on advanced market commitments, prize mechanisms for agricultural innovation and technology, and so on. So this is a subject very close to our heart, and thank you for coming. Almost a year ago, some of you will remember, we hosted an event also with Joachim and his colleagues to discuss the status of the bank's Program for Results instrument. And since then, quite a lot has happened. The instrument has in fact been created, which is no mean achievement considering it's only the third instrument that the World Bank has ever created. So that is something. There are 5 operations that have been approved, and there's a pipeline. And so the way things are looking, we might have 20 or perhaps even 30 operations at the end of a couple of years with a significant volume of financing. So this is really quite a big experiment in terms of a new way of doing business, and it's something that I think should be of interest to everybody who's interested in trying to tie financing to development results. And of course, there have been areas of debate, and you can see some of that reflected in the discussion at our last meeting here. On the one hand, questions about effectiveness. Will this instrument really lead to more effective development financing? Not only in the resources that the bank provides, but also in the resources that are included in the programs that the bank supports. This leverage issue is a very important one for this instrument. And on the other hand, the concerns around safeguards, fiduciary safeguards, environmental safeguards, and social safeguards. How will the new processes work? And will they work as well as, or hopefully better than, the old ones? Both of these have been debated issues. We won't know the answers for some time, of course, but at least now we have a first start in understanding how these operations are being put together, which is, I think, a great way to begin. Joachim will first provide an update on where we are. Then we're going to have opening comments from our 3 discussants. Then we'll open up to discussion and give time for the team to respond. The meeting formally closes at 11:30, but I'm sure that if some of you have specific issues that you want to raise, that some of the bank staff would be available to answer questions a little after that. I hope that's okay. If I should check that with you. Let me then, without any ado, introduce Joachim van Ansberg. Joachim is the Vice President for Operations Policy and Country Services at the bank. Before that, he was Country Director for Indonesia and the Philippines. He's worked on the bank's Brazil programs. He has very wide experience. He was a member of the World Bank's Governance and Anti-Corruption Strategy Steering Committee, and he's been on too many task forces and other things to mention in a short bio. So, Joachim, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alan, for the kind introduction and for the invitation and for bringing us together, and thank you for your interest in this topic. I do fondly remember our meeting here about a year ago. At that time, we were still putting final touches to the proposal and trying to gather the support from our board for supporting the introduction of the new instrument. And frankly, discussions such as the one we had in this room were extraordinarily helpful for improving the proposal and actually getting the support from our shareholders for introducing the proposal. So at that time we said we would come back here and discuss the real experience of how does this instrument work in practice, and that's why we are here. With me are quite a few colleagues, but in particular Fadia, Aymeric, and Susan, who are directly working on the Program for Results team, and who I will call upon in the discussion to come in with specific information on operations that they have been involved in. Let me just briefly recap what we did, why we went to introduce Program for Results. As you may be familiar with the World Bank's usual way of operation, we have two original instruments. One is project financing, where the World Bank finances specific expenditures and disburses against specific expenditures that our partner countries undertake for their investment projects. And that's a typical project approach in which the host of World Bank policies, from environmental, social, fiduciary safeguards that Alan mentioned to others, apply in the typical World Bank project many of you would be familiar with. And on the other hand, we have budget support. We call it development policy lending, where we disburse into the general budget to support general policy or specific policy reforms. What has been missing was a programmatic instrument, meaning support for government programs that go beyond specific projects, but that are more specific than the overall budget expenditures. And other agencies who work in development have such instruments. The EU has sector budget support. Other institutions have programmatic instruments, sector-wide approaches, and the like. The World Bank didn't. So we proposed Program for Results to fill that gap of a programmatic instrument, and tied the disbursements under this programmatic instrument to results. And that's where our conversation really focused on last year, where disbursements would no longer be made for expenditures against expenditures or against policy reforms undertaken, but for results. And we had a lot of discussion, what are results and so on, outputs, outcomes, intermediate results and the like, and we can come back to that. So we set out to introduce this instrument to respond to client demand for more effectiveness of our support. We introduced it to focus on results. In the overall modernization of the World Bank, just like in other institutions, we've been under increasing appropriate and welcome pressure to ensure that support we're providing does indeed lead to development outcomes and results. So a very natural step is to think about the incentives that produce results, and very natural for a bank is to think about money as an incentive, and therefore tying disbursements to results is a pretty logical step if you want to create incentives for focusing on results. We wanted to create an instrument that would, more than our traditional project support, focus on building a country's or a program's own institutions and capacities. I think there has been recognition that some of the project-type support that is very much focused on creating sort of ring-fenced arrangements is not as effective in building country institutions, country systems, as broader support through a programmatic instrument. So this was another objective. And finally, we wanted to be better partners. We heard the criticism, especially from some of the bilateral partners, loud and clear, who felt the World Bank was not as responsive as I think desired under some of the aid effectiveness discussions in terms of pooling resources either with government or with other development partners. And here again we were seeking a way of improving the way we work. So we introduced Program for Results a year ago, just the third instrument. In addition to the project lending, the policy lending, now we have program lending, Program for Results. Where are we? As Alan already mentioned, the first 5 operations have been approved for almost $1 billion, supporting part of government spending of $2.3 billion. Now, for those of you who know the World Bank well, you know that we are a very decentralized organization, a very bottom-up organization. So when we introduce a new instrument, it's not like Fadia and I go out and tell our country teams, you do this, you do that, and it happens. No, it's a very different process. It's country directors, country teams, sitting with their counterparts in government and offering as part of the menu of how the World Bank supports a country something new, which is Program for Results. And it evolves naturally as part of a country relationship, part of a country program, where then over time this becomes part of the fabric of the menu of offerings of World Bank support. So not surprising, and I think positively, the experience of those 5 and the subsequent operations is actually very, very different. And you will see that there is very little centralized design. In fact, a lot of experimentation, which I think is a bonus because it actually allows us to learn much more than if this was kind of a central rollout. Remember, we are financing loans and credits to governments, which means every operation is owned by government, demanded by government, in the end based on a loan or credit agreement between the World Bank and government. So the government is the key actor in this, and therefore not surprising that each government actually responds very differently to our offer and provides very different input and design to these operations. So if you look at the pipeline, you will actually see a very large diversity. So 5 operations approved, I'll show them in a moment. 14 operations scheduled to be approved in the next, I guess, 6 months, 7 months. We have a pretty wide range of experience, and both in terms of countries and in terms of sectors. Here you see the countries. The red were this 5 operations approved: Uruguay, Morocco, Tanzania, Nepal, Vietnam. And the blue dots are the countries where we have operations scheduled to be approved in the next 6 months. So you have middle-income countries like Brazil. You have quite fragile countries like Nepal. So it's, as we had hoped, a pretty widespread of different country circumstances with very different country capacity, which I think is important because we wanted to test how in different environments this instrument would fare with stronger or not so strong institutions. Here's the slide I was hoping for. The 5 operations that have been approved to make this discussion a little more concrete. Morocco is a project I had a chance to visit briefly myself. It's the King's Poverty Reduction Program. It's a very large national social program by the government, which the World Bank has been supporting over time and is now supporting through Program for Results. I think a very good example of focusing our input on what makes clients feel we are responding and makes us focus on the results as opposed to the processes. The country team has been struggling with this program in the past because our investment lending policies, as I mentioned in the beginning, are not particularly well geared toward supporting a government program. Because we come with a whole lot of World Bank policies that we insist in our project lending government adopt. But if government runs literally the King's Poverty Reduction Program, we can't really expect that government adopts World Bank rules instead of its own laws and regulations, especially when they're reasonably robust in terms of achieving key objectives like good fiduciary oversight. So here I think a very good example where a programmatic approach actually has changed and made us much more responsive and effective in supporting a government program, and now makes us disburse against indicators such as, and these are just examples, graduation rates in the education system, or percentage of population provided with improved water supply in small dispersed rural water supply projects. So I think here a very good example of the programmatic nature of Program for Results. And Nepal was the second operation. Very different context, much weaker institutional environment, of course a country that has suffered from some conflict. Here, in a sense, more straightforward design, focused on completion rehabilitation of minor bridges, small footbridges. Nepal, country with many valleys and rough terrain, and a national government program to complete or rehabilitate small bridges. The disbursement here very simple. 4 bridges completed. It's a nice story because all over the world you have a lot of half bridges, and half a bridge doesn't produce half the benefits of a full bridge. Half a bridge doesn't produce any benefits. So very simplistic example of how disbursing for results makes a big difference. Because if you build 50% of a bridge, you disburse 50% of the money, but you actually achieve no results. If you complete a bridge, we disburse, and I think there the incentives are very clear and very compelling. The third operation I want to talk about is Tanzania, local government. That was actually not so much what we had in mind, I think is fair to say, when we designed Program for Results. And yet we see in the pipeline quite a few operations focused on local government institution building. So here we are financing, in a sense, part of the intergovernmental transfer system, and the disbursement indicators are not so much the physical outputs or the outcomes, but are rather indicators of institutional improvements. So there's a rating system by which the performance of local governments is assessed, and disbursements are made as an incentive for better institutional management of funds at the local level. It's an interesting experiment. Interestingly, there is quite a bit of demand for that kind of approach, even though it is a result that is in a sense intermediate. And yet, if you, I think, share our belief that institutions and institutional capacity are absolutely central to the achievement of development outcomes, it actually does make sense to think about support for this intermediate kinds of results. But it's something we're watching carefully, supporting, but want to learn from. Is this an effective way of achieving, in the end, ultimate results? Because, of course, we're supporting institutional improvements because we want these institutions to achieve outputs and outcomes, ultimate outcomes for the population. And there are a couple more operations: Vietnam, rural water, and Uruguay, road infrastructure. Again, rehabilitation and maintenance of roads. So we can talk a bit more about this practical experience, but let me just sum up some of the early feedback we have received. Just a few weeks ago, we brought together a large team of World Bank staff who work on these operations across the world. Very interesting opportunity to just learn from each other. So we're trying to build a community of practice within the World Bank of staff to learn from each other and benefit from each other's experience. What's working well? Results focus. I've been myself in a few conversations, and the feedback is consistent that the dialogue with our counterparts is changing from a focus on disbursement and procedures to a focus on results. What we had hoped that by tying disbursement to results, you would change the mindset, and the focus of the conversation is happening. The conversation with the high level, the ministers, but also with the implementing agencies, is forced to be on results, because in the end there's an incentive behind that. And that's a very significant change. Maybe it should have always been like this, but we're happy that with this instrument we're actually achieving that, the conversations are focused on results and on removing obstacles to achieving results, as opposed to simply removing obstacles to implementing contracts, implementing inputs, which is the more traditional project mode. I think we have initial experience that is positive in terms of supporting programs. The Morocco program indicates that, where we are financing a relatively modest part of a larger program. But I want to come back to that, because there's one of the drawbacks related to that I think is beginning to emerge. I think we have positive experience with the sort of emerging strengthening of country and partner systems, meaning the assessments that are part of a new operation. Our team with government conducts an assessment of the fiduciary aspects of a program, the technical aspects of the program, and the social environmental aspects of the program. These assessments are meant to, one, give us and our shareholders the comfort that nothing undue happens in those programs that we couldn't support. On the other hand, help to build the quality of those systems. And that seems to be happening to some extent, or to a significant extent. And feedback from the partners has been positive, that we're really bringing down transaction costs, that the very high share of World Bank staff effort that in project lending is spent on transactions processing, literally bill checking, that in our view often is not the most effective use of our scarce resources, is really improving. So positive feedback there. Couple of concerns that are emerging. First concern about exclusions, and this comes back to the program support that I mentioned. we discussed at the time of the introduction last year a few measures to provide comfort to those who are skeptical, in particular excluding from Program for Results support large-scale projects that included large procurement packages or higher social environmental risk, so-called Category A projects. I still think that was the right decision, because we wanted to clearly show there's a space for project support, which is where we need our focus on inputs and focus on sometimes quite procedurally heavy requirements on fiduciary and safeguards oversight, and then there are programs. But we have gotten in a few of the examples gotten to a situation where we end up with carve-outs, meaning a large government program. For example, when we're working on preparing in Ethiopia, a large government health program has a few large procurement contracts in it. What do you do with that? They are sort of technically excluded from Program for Results, so we are pushed to an awkward way of, in a sense, carving them out and sort of excluding them from what we're supporting in a very artificial way. And that's where I think we are getting into sort of the old mode of saying, well, we sort of build our own fence around what we are comfortable supporting, and government continues to do the things we're not so comfortable with or we cannot support outside of our sphere of support. And that's not really in the spirit of what we're trying to do here, and yet is a pragmatic way of dealing with that. Second concern, I think, is about, because we've excluded Category A projects, but here's again the issue of carve-out. So, for example, in Nepal, a few of the bridges were, in a sense, excluded from the program because they were in the larger category. Now, of course, they're still being done. So I think from a development effectiveness point of view, we wash our hands because we say that's outside of the World Bank program. But is that the right approach, frankly? Because actually our involvement could potentially make those programs better. And so just carving them out isn't really effective. It just gives us the opportunity to say, well, that's happening outside of our sphere of influence. I talked about the capacity building and about, for example, the Australian support in Nepal, and I think a line of work that is very promising, which is working together with bilaterals who support some of the capacity gaps that are identified in the assessments, and therefore I think make both bilateral technical assistance plus World Bank financing together more effective and create synergies that I think neither one of us alone could achieve. So in sum, I think we have a diverse set of early experiences, far too early to draw any conclusive lessons, but overall positive experience. I think we are on track to achieve what we're setting out to achieve, but need to watch it very carefully. Need to make sure the results focus stays front and center, doesn't get diverted by the strong focus on the assessments and the risk coverage, risk management systems. We have a few issues identified to work on, and we have some particularly interesting learning experiences, such as the definition of results in terms of institutional progress by local governments. We have more information on the pipeline of future programs that we can share. My colleagues can respond to specific questions on that. But I already want to thank you for your interest, and certainly happy to share more and I think respond also to your input. We really want to create, beyond the World Bank, a learning community on these instruments, or participate in the learning community, because we know this is certainly innovative for us. Other organizations have considerable experience in that we want to benefit from, but we also want to take our experience to others who can learn and benefit from that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for a really concise but I think very thoughtful and detailed overview of where we are today. So thank you. The next stage is to invite our discussants to come up. I think Paul and Simon, if you'd like to come up. We have three discussants to open with comments. Let me briefly introduce them while they're coming up. Paul O'Brien Paul's with Oxfam. He oversees Oxfam America's policy, campaigning, and private sector engagement. He's had extensive experience in Afghanistan, and he's worked in a number of other countries. I won't go into his bio, it's quite long. Bill Savadoff, who's at the center and joining us remotely. Bill has been working extensively in the area of aid effectiveness and policy, and he's one of the authors, together with Nancy Birdsall, of the book on cash on delivery aid. And Simon Bohr, he is an advisor to the World Bank's executive director for the United Kingdom, and he's served in the Treasury in a number of areas before that. Simon has also, I think, been quite intensively involved in the discussion on some of these instruments with the World Bank as it has developed them. So we look forward very much to your comments. Paul, would you like to kick off, please?
Okay, great. Well, thanks, and thanks for a great presentation. So, in short, Oxfam is a fan, but I'm going to say a little bit about why we think this is really important, and we wouldn't be Oxfam if we didn't challenge you in some respects. But so why important? Well, one, when was the last time before this that the bank put, what's the word I'm looking for, put out a new instrument? How long has it been?
Almost 32 years.
Okay. So it's been a while, and this is a reflection of, I think, the bank's own thinking on where the discussion is going. And when they do this once every few decades, we should all probably take notice. I am particularly interested in where the bank thinks development is going when I sit in a town where US aid is on the defensive for trying to give less than a third of its funding to local institutions. So clearly this initiative has the potential not just to change how the bank thinks, but to change the broader discussion about what right-headed development is. But I have a second reason that I think it's important, and it is to do with the fact Joachim sort of compared this to sector budget support, and I think that's really important. So I want to lay out for you very briefly a way of looking at the developing world and the challenges and opportunities that we're facing, and then how this instrument speaks to that world. If you accept that there's a pretty simplistic typology of three types of political environments we're dealing with right now, this is very unscientific, but I'm going to describe as the first type. Maybe it's a Ghana, but it's a place where there's a fair degree of homogeneity in the public sphere around whether the state ought to be held accountable by its own population. Civil society is fairly strong. I think I just looked at Transparency International the other day and saw that the closest country to Ghana, which ranked higher on Transparency International's corruption index, was Italy. And Rwanda actually ranks a little higher, but it's further away than Italy. But that's basically it for Africa, okay? So these are high-ranking countries, lots of transparency, and the real challenge there, I was there for a couple of weeks, and I worked out through a back-of-the-envelope thing. Please, unscientific Roxfam researchers would kill me, but I worked out that of a dollar in oil money that arrives in Ghana from the coastline, about 2 cents makes its way to explicitly poverty-reducing projects on the ground. And the real debate for all of us is how do we not get growth quantity, because they're growing at 13%, but how do we improve growth quality so that those of us who care about poverty get more of the right kinds of investment. So that's the Ghanas of this world. There aren't many of them, frankly. Maybe Tanzania and Uruguay on the list we saw are getting in that direction. At the far end are those homogeneously repressive regimes where basically the government is disinterested in open dialogue from civil society, being held accountable by its citizens on the big money flows. Not just aid and lending that the bank engages in, but the big natural resource money, that $1 trillion worth of oil wealth that some say is going to get dug out of Africa's ground. They don't want that discussion in the public sphere. They don't want to be held accountable by their own citizens. Maybe they have some ideas about how it'll be spent, but they don't seek political legitimacy from their own populations by the transparent and accountable spending of public resources. They have other ways of getting that legitimacy. There's a smaller number of countries, and they're very difficult for us to work in, and many of us just deal with the mess that gets created as a consequence of those regimes by doing humanitarian crisis work. The really interesting one is the pile in the middle, where you basically have very heterogeneous polities. You have, within those governments, actors who seek political legitimacy by being accountable to their own citizens. They also want international legitimacy. They want to be seen as development actors who are effective and responsible. You also have a bunch of folks in those governments that have no interest in gaining that kind of legitimacy. They get their power from elsewhere, they get their resources from elsewhere, and when they see a big pile of money coming in from the bank or from somewhere else or from oil resources, they want to get as much of it for a what you'd call transparency and accountability agenda as possible. And there is a battle royal going on in those hybrid environments. I worked in one for 5 years. I was in the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan, and I watched as a certain group tried to get political legitimacy and momentum by doing effective development in a few key ministries, and while in other ministries, no interest. In fact, they were put there basically to get a particular political or military group in line. Our goal in Afghanistan was empower the technocrats, make them stronger, give them an incentivized interest in engaging in effective development, and marginalize those who had no interest in the international development agenda. That was pretty much the game. P4R steps into that world and offers an incredibly powerful tool to incentivize those political actors who see their own legitimacy in being accountable to their own citizens. It gives them the ability to start a dialogue about accountability and effective development on the ground. So if you look at it in that sphere, it becomes an incredibly, and it's particularly because it's sectoral, that gives it that power. And empower the right kinds of behaviors, marginalize and disempower the wrong kinds of behaviors and actors. We think of P4R as incredibly effective for all the reasons Joachim talked about. It uses country systems, it cares about institutional strengthening, it doesn't treat it as just an incidental byproduct. It's willing to let countries learn by doing. In many of those environments, that far-sighted technocrat, I worked for one in Ghana, is a marginal actor who's trying to get just a little bit of power and a little bit of legitimacy. One of the bank's most proud investments, in my view, was managing to get the National Solidarity Program up in one tiny little ministry in 2002, MRRD, and ultimately spending a couple of $1 billion without it getting stolen, and empowering one technocratically oriented ministry, while as if you've given it to most of the ministries, maybe health, maybe later education, you would have had it stolen. So it's the fact that it's willing to take some risks in these fragile environments that makes it relevant to that balance of power issue. And of course, in the end of the day, it's outcome rather than input focused. But I'm going to close with this challenge. It was very interesting to see the first 5. And then I see the list of possible countries that are about to enter into the mainstream. Ethiopia, Pakistan, Uganda, amongst them. And I'm asking myself, how are those polities? Where's the balance of power? Is it possible that we could incentivize really responsible and good behavior? Maybe. Maybe there are some social actors in some of those contexts. I know Pakistan a little better than others, and yes, there's definitely a possibility of discussion, but it's high-risk stuff. So here are some of the recommendations we would be thinking about if you were about empowering and strengthening the institutions in a very explicit way to get responsible action and actors at the forefront. Keep the focus on country ownership and be very explicit about incentivizing the right kinds of actions and behaviors in everything you do. I mean, be more explicit about the politics of this, even though that is sometimes difficult. And the way you talk about it, I think, is the way to do it. It's about institutions and making them strong. It's going to be about letting them lead and be seen to lead by their own populations on policy. There's always a danger with these kinds of things when people do the shorthand. Nepal, bridges. Tanzania, urban government, that somehow that was the only decision that mattered, and it really got made by outsiders because we thought that was a viable project. That kills the idea that technocrat was actually leading a discussion with their own citizens. Obviously, measuring the right results for us means actually, we love that Tanzania example. Because if Tanzania is getting close to Ghana, you really do want to get more of their money spent and all their natural resource money spent on fighting poverty. That's got to come from citizen demand. So measure the ability of local government to be responsive to what, as we all know, politics is local. Local communities are saying about what they want, and celebrate it when you get it right. And finally, on that vexing challenge of safe to do, is strengthen that compact between a responsible set of government actors and an increasingly strong set of civilian actors. Then you challenge them to put the safeguards in place. You challenge them to do the investigations. And yes, you investigate to make sure that they're doing it. But the real success story we'd love to be able to tell a few years from now is that story where the government minister said, this is not good enough. And I have, the World Bank and others have my back when she stands there in front of her own political actors and her own citizenry and says, I am demanding higher standards on safeguards for environment or for sustainability. I did my investigation and I want a review. And we are behind her. Then we have that long-term victory, which is going to pay off in that intergenerational way that we all care about.
Thank you, Paul, for very interesting comments to lead off. Let's now turn to Bill. Bill, are you on? Bill?
I put him to sleep.
Oh, you put him to sleep, did you? How do we unmute?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, great. Sorry I couldn't be there. I've been having some trouble with the webcam, so if it freezes, as it seems to have done, I'll just rely on the audio, and so that I wish I could be there with you all. I'm very excited about the P4R thing moving on. I was also involved in those early discussions, and so to see that 5 of these operations are up and running is great. And I want to echo what Joachim said about the importance of experimentation. This is there are hypotheses about how these results programs are going to work, but the actual way things like this happen in societies, complex societies and politics, not only internally in the countries, but in the relationship between the countries and the World Bank or the international community, are going to evolve in different ways. And so the fact that you're getting a wide range of experimentation is great. So congratulations for moving ahead with this. So what I'm going to do with my remarks is to focus a little bit more. I'm coming at this from the angle of someone who worked on investment loans in the 1990s at the Inter-American Development Bank, moved into understanding issues of sector lending, and have come to work in the last few years on cash on delivery aid and the idea of really pushing what a payment for performance or payment for results kind of operation can do. And there are a lot of theories behind what these different what this simple mechanism can do. And for some people, the idea of paying against results is really just about clarifying the planning instrument or improving management of an operation. For other people, the core is the incentives that it creates. It's going to somehow engender a different behavior by the people who are receiving the payments for the results. And another possible theory, which is one where I'm much more focused on, is this issue that it actually changes the relationship between the lender or the donor and the person borrowing or receiving the funds. And I think in Paul's comments that came out very clearly. He's seeing it as an important part of changing the World Bank's relationship with the countries. But where I'm going to go is to say, how far are these things really going? How much experimentation have you gotten? Have you really reached what payment for results can do? And I think you've moved very far. These things move very far. I think but there's some very key ways in which they're not really giving us the full range of variation we need to see how much you can take it. You can build these things like the country ownership aspect. And so as I was reading through the documentation, I had the sense, are these traditional investment loans trying to improve their management of a plan, of operating a plan, by being clearer and more specific about what progress is? Or are they really some kind of new program that really focuses on the results and then allows the space created by that for the countries to make progress? And if it's going to do that, it has to be seen. You have to admit, it essentially limits discretion for the World Bank, because if it really were focused on the results and the bank weren't involved in designing the program or all these other things, you'd pay out whether or not the results were there, not whether or not things were done according to some assessment plan. And for the country, it would mean a lot more responsibility and discretion on their part, because they have all the opportunities to do it how they see fit. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. In a sense, it doesn't really matter if this is, improved investment loan or all the way cash on delivery aid, because in the first case, at least we're improving the programs. In the second case, we're gaining experience with how these things work, because to go to a pure cash on delivery aid type program, you still need to know what kind of results are the right kind to measure, what's a good way to measure it, how to do it credibly, and so forth. So I had two different images reading these things. One was training wheels on a bicycle, that some of these operations seem like they put the bicycle in, but they don't want to start going without the training wheels in place. The extra safeguards, the extra checks, the agreement on a plan ahead of time that make it look more like an investment loan. A lot of standard bank project work, procurement rules, reports, and so forth, or if they really are offset by fewer of those. The second part is on local ownership, so that's fewer transaction costs. The second part is local ownership of strategies. And here, based on Joachim's presentation, I have the sense the program in Morocco and program in Tanzania really are much more country-owned. The impression I got from the documents was these look like it's the language of international development that is in these programs. And it looks to me like the World Bank was heavily involved in developing them. And if really the goal was the bridges, and the payment is against the bridges, what's the point of having disbursement-linked indicators against faster bidding procedures or other kinds of process indicators, which really have to be achieved if the outcome you're looking for, the bridges or the participation of women in community decisions, happens. I noticed, for example, in the Morocco project, there was some sub-program that was left out because it wasn't designed. Well, in a real performance for results program or cash on delivery aid extreme, you would start by asking what was that program supposed to achieve and figure out what the appropriate payment is for that. You'd let the design happen in the course of the country working it out itself. So fewer transaction costs, it seems to me that may be there, but it wasn't clear. Local ownership of strategies, again, seems to be there, not so sure. Probably more in some of these programs than other ones. But the one that really concerns me most is whether any of these programs, how many of these disbursement-linked indicators are really going to be achieved? Are we really going to know were achieved? Most of these disbursement-linked indicators are going to be reported by a government office, a management information system, administrative reporting systems. That's fine. Governments need to have information systems themselves to develop the information, find out what's going on. But just having an external auditor come in and check the documentation to see that it's consistent still doesn't tell us whether, for example, the Morocco project, they're getting accurate information about the percentage of girls in those dormitories. And that, I'll just focus on that example because choosing percentage means that not only does the management information system of the government have to give you the number of girls in those dorms, it has to have information about the population of girls in that area. No management information system has that. So the proper way to do that is to have some kind of a survey, external survey, that allows you to cross-check the management information system. And rather than seeing that as an intrusive outside verification, it's actually a help to the government because it allows it to detect faults in its management information system if it's not capturing stuff. The Uruguay Roads project, it's going to be hiring auditors. It's not clear what kind of information the auditors are looking at. Is it the consistency of the documentation, which doesn't generate an external check, or does it actually go out and see the road before the maintenance is done, see the road afterwards, and check the amount of material there? It seems to me as the bank moves forward in these future operations and as it looks at the experience with these ones, it needs to think about how to make sure that the results are credibly measured. That means if there's no baseline, in the approval, I don't think you can verify, if you can't convince me that you've been able to verify the baseline, then it's very hard to convince me that you're going to be able to verify progress against a baseline. We need to know that there was no bridge there before somebody goes to check if the bridge was built. The Tanzanian project is fascinating, but it's also more the standards of what those indicators are is much less clear. I didn't see documentation on the Vietnam one. I think the fact that they were supposed to be disbursements linked against the numbers of girls rather than percentages gives me greater confidence that that may be a real payment for results. Percentages, when I see them in documents and they're in round numbers, they can't be real. They must be a guesstimate of what's going on. And only if there's some sort of external information coming in am I going to feel at the end of the day, and with the citizens in the country or the bank board, feel confident that the results really were achieved. And so I'll just close by coming back to Joachim's point about countries complaining about the intrusive nature of the right to investigate. And it was interesting, I wasn't sure when I saw the slide, I wasn't sure right to investigate in what terms. Right to investigate whether results were achieved or something else. And what you emphasized was corruption controls. And here, it seems to me that there's a very key conceptual shift that the World Bank and its clients can make, which is if you're really verifying the results and you've paid for those results, how can you achieve them if there was corruption? There's a basic inconsistency there. And so it seems to me the way to deal with that is to go to the clients and sit down and have a discussion where you say, you don't like these corruption controls. If the harder we can push on getting a real external verification of the results, the easier we can be around the corruption controls. Because if we have a very solid knowledge that the results were achieved, we have much greater confidence that the money was spent appropriately. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Finally, but not least, Simon, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by just agreeing with all the other speakers so far about the positives of the PforR instrument and how much of a really welcome innovation it is for the World Bank. There's no need for me to repeat all the reasons that people have said they think this is a great instrument. And one key thing is just it should improve development outcomes, clearly, both by incentivizing the right ways, governments, but also shifting the debate to be much more about the outcomes and giving that greater ownership, as I think we've all spoken about. The second part is it also should give more sustainable development outcomes for the countries. It's not just about the development outputs or even inputs as DPLs and ILs are, but it's about improving those country systems, and that's really important to delivering that greater sustainability. Besides that, I want to move on, accepting the positives of the principle. So why is this, why I think this debate even so far has shown a really important thing of PforR. And I think it's about how it changes the nature of the debate. And that's very much the case at the board. It's not just the case of talking about safeguards or talking about the level of disbursements or the period of disbursements. As we've heard just now, as Bill was just saying, well, what are the results? How do you measure them? Should they be about percentages? Should they be actual numbers? And I think that is the kind of debate about results that we should be having. And it's right to have that debate about what is the right kinds of outcomes we should have. And it's often debate that so far at the board, at least at the bank, we don't normally have. For the 5 PforRs so far, we have been having that discussion. And I think we can have a debate about exactly how PforR should work going forward. The fact is that it exists, and it allows now the bank to have that very outcome-focused discussion with all of you, with shareholders, with other donors. And I think that's an example of, that's a reason why PforR is an example of best practice, and the bank moving to that best practice, both the sorts of results-based mechanisms that many people here have done work on, that a range of donors already implement, and the bank itself has implemented informally for a number of years, and now it's become formalized. So I think in terms of the debate at the board, I think the improvements are clear already. There are different views, and I think that's perfectly natural, but the debate moving to outcomes, I think, is incredibly valuable. I want to highlight a few things about some specific projects and some of the things that the board has done, which I think highlight some of the interesting things so far already in these 5 P4Rs. The first one on Morocco, I think is really interesting. One of the indicators was about increased participation. So I think not just is there transparency around what we want these projects to lead to, but some of these outcomes can also be about improving transparency and accountability within the project itself, and I think that's great. The Tanzania one, I think is one where there was debate about what is the right kind of indicators we should be using. Again, I think this comes back to the discussion we've been having. Should they be inputs and institutional focused? Should they be outcomes? I think that's a great debate. I agree that I think it makes a lot of sense in that example to have ones that build institutions. There are clearly members of the board who think much more things should be outcome focused. And the final was on Vietnam, which I want to flag as being a great example for a few reasons. First, it really brought together, or really meshed well with work of other donors in the region. So it focused on certain parts of water sanitation, while other donors were picking up other aspects, and while the government itself was implementing other sister programs to benefit. So I think that's PforR slotting in very well with the wider development work in that particular sector. The other thing we've spoken about is oversight and maintaining that scrutiny, which Bill asked a range of questions about. And one thing I think was really good in the Vietnam one is part of the TA, part of the institution building, was around institution building for the Supreme Auditor in Vietnam to allow the Vietnam Supreme Auditor to have that capacity to deliver and effectively and independently monitor the outcomes for the project. I think that's really important and a really good model that I hope could be replicated to ensure that monitoring capacity is improved. I'd like to end just by a couple of quick thoughts about where next for P4R. I think we're, certainly from the UK, very excited to see P4R move into other types of country environment, other sectors. I think that keen to see early results. I know it will take some time, but seeing how this double win of development plus sustainability with institutions, I think will be really important. And finally, in the longer term, I think it would be very interesting to see how this sort of output-based aid, results-based financing can apply not just to P4R, but be extended to more of the operations of the bank. How could this sorts of principles be applied to ILs or DPLs and be extended throughout more of what the bank does?
Thank you to all our discussants. I suggest we open up now. We have about maybe 20 minutes where we can take questions, comments from the floor, and then we'll go back to our presenter and perhaps the panelists to ask them to comment. So let's open up. I have 1, 2, 3, 2 or 3. Well, I have 2 here anyway, right now. Please, if you can give us your name, just so that we know who it is.
Yes, Jim Michael. I'm a consultant, independent consultant now in development cooperation. 2 very quick questions of a very general nature. One is on these disbursement-linked indicators. I assume that if you're working with a government program, let's say roads in Nepal or local government in another country, there's a national program. And in that national program, they have objectives and they have key performance indicators for whether they're achieving them or not. Then you come along. And to what extent are your indicators collaboratively arrived at so that they fit with the government program? And then the second related sort of point is, since we're at Center for Global Development, I thought I'd have to ask about impact evaluation. If you have a national program like that and you're doing some part of it, what is distinctive about your part that enables you to evaluate what value you're adding as opposed to what the government program is accomplishing?
Thank you very much. Please.
Bob Berg. Jim was the former chair of the DAC, and I was the founding chair of evaluation of the DAC, so let me follow your question, Jim. Comment, first of all, I hope you've retained the right to choose implementing agencies. I remember Norm Uphoff's early work in Nepal on bridge repairs when he found that local, provincial maintenance organizations were 10-15% of the cost of the national government and much heavier on the labor component. Anyway, just a notion. On impact, I know there'll be objections about cash flow because it takes a long time to have impact, and then, but couldn't you phase a little bit into this? I was thinking about the Moroccan case. What if by year 5 you had an impact, you switched to an impact measure in which you in fact share a little bit of the investment risk as to what the outcomes are, and maybe even give some kind of a balloon payment, a bonus for really strong impact. So you shift government's thinking towards that much more important result.
Thank you. Please, yes.
Thank you. I'm Keiichiro Nakaza from JICA. My question is very practical. 2 quick questions. One is there any example that your task manager tried to combine investment project and PforR? In the real development world, there are a lot of examples that, one or a few big investment projects together with a lot of small projects make the results. And the second one is, payments for results sounds great for us, great for the government or taxpayers, but may not sound great for the contractors. So, which means, government needs to pay to the contractors, based on the progress of the project, but not against the project. So I wonder whether there is any case that project gets delayed because of the late payment of the government to the contractors.
Please, your chance. Other questions? Please, yes. Thank you.
Tom Oakley, just a consultant.
Sorry, can we give you a mic to Bill can also hear?
Excuse me, Tom Oakley, a consultant. The one question is really, with this underlies a lot of risk, and what is the appetite for the bank for risk in these types of projects, and at which point do those become politically unpalatable?
Thank you very much. Others? Yes, I have 2 more. Thank you.
Tom Timberg, consultant. This really responds particularly to 2 comments of Mr. Savadoff. Obviously, one of the problems in auditing results or anything else in many of the countries we work is you need to have good field verification and indeed probably field verification of baselines. I just wondered, however, there's also a related concept of, as they say, audit risk. And I was intrigued by your assumption that there was much of an audit risk in the case of Nepal, that bridges were being built at places where bridges were already in place, as distinguished from, and that is a risk, 2 bridges are being built and being billed to 2 different donors. I mean, I think that's more likely. And the other question I wondered in terms of audit risk is, yes, percentage of women, students, etc., but I would have thought a dormitory and the percentage of women in the dormitory would probably be something which, again, poses a relatively low audit risk, especially because there's so many other external documentations of the costs and the staff and the structure involved in the dormitory. And I guess the final question is, this is the more general question that has been raised about the bank asking for too much. I think that's undoubtedly frequently true, but I do think that you probably need some sort of right of complaint, in the sense that in order for the kinds of societies that you're talking about to occur, the civil society has to be able to address its complaints somewhere, and if the country concerned doesn't have a credible place to direct those, the World Bank could indeed be the place to direct them, and this is important, without affecting the disbursement of funds. This is really a question of, as is impact evaluation, etc., of the overall post-evaluation of a project, presumably for the lessons going forward.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you. It's kind of a follow-up question. I feel like we have talked a lot about effectiveness in achieving results, and I wonder about efficiency. So if you want to achieve impact, and I will follow up on our colleague's second, the person who made the second comment, if we want to be involved in impact rather than results, will the bank be obliged to be more engaged at the design level as well? Is that a kind of a return or like a revisiting of the way the bank will engage? And the second point is about leverage. I am not sure to what extent there is coordination and leverage in terms of the scarce resources that are mobilized. So from the perspective of how the bank selects the interventions within a particular program in a country, but also in terms of designing something bigger than what the program that is already there exists. So what kind of leverages are there in terms of efficiently really achieving results and then maybe impact?
Which came up to me when I was looking at these operations. And the one was, for example, people have mentioned already the conditions about number of girls in dormitories who passed the next grade. And when I first read that, I thought, well, you do have a numerator and denominator issue. And boy, if I wanted to make sure that the girls passed, the percentage in the dormitories passed, I'd just make sure to kick out any ones that I thought were going to fail. It would be very easy to do that. And, we have all these debates about selective education and, for example, whether charter schools leave out children who are very difficult who have particular problems. So that was the sort of question on my mind. And the second one relates to Tanzania. And I think when you look through these operations, you'll see Tanzania is really a different animal from the others. The others are very much output focused, even Morocco. And Tanzania really doesn't have many outputs. It only has really pretty much process judgment, although it has provision for some audits of value. And one of the questions I have is, why doesn't that operation have any benchmarks? Because I think Bill made the question that if you have a monitoring system and you can't establish a clear benchmark with it, are you sure that you can then benchmark progress? And with another question on that operation, how do you cost out the value of the operation? In other words, if I have an operation like for bridges or for roads in Uruguay, I have a pretty good idea of what I'm providing in funding relative to what I think the expenditure program is. But if you have a program with no preset spending at all in terms of very specific ex-ante investments, then how do you have any relationship between what you're putting in and what you're expecting out? And I can understand this because the other side of that picture is to say, well, if we specify everything in advance, then we're constraining a natural process of the development of local government. So it's not an easy answer. But those were two questions that came to my mind when looking through the documentation. Anyway, I think we've given you a lot to think about, ranging from the political economy of the countries, where I think Paul started out, to the question of is there really leadership at the country level, and how do we encourage that, and is this really a big change? And then a number of the other issues that arose, including particularly the incentives issue and the validations issue and so on. Joachim, perhaps you'd like to give us a response, and then if we have a chance, we'll let any of our panel chime in. Thanks.
Thank you very much for very good comments, discussant contributions, and questions. This is a learning dialogue, so I won't be able to provide perfect answers to all the questions because some of them are genuinely open questions that I think are inspirations for us to do further work. But there are a few points I do want to touch upon. I'm glad Paul made the political economy of our work much more explicit than I did. Alan mentioned in the introduction I was country director for the World Bank in a couple of countries for many years. And as a country director, my main job was to make those judgments, and in a sense, identify in a country what are the areas where we can actually have that impact that you're describing, which means finding a reform leader who actually wants to build local accountability systems and make a difference, and then providing support to that part of government in order to sort of create momentum for reform, political sustainability by producing results, and so building the local accountability loop. That's the main job of the judgments we are making day to day. Now, we don't talk about this so explicitly all the time, but I'm very comfortable with the way you talk about it. And in fact, P4R does allow us the kind of flexibility to draw the circle wider or narrower around that center we want to support. And I think that will explain why you see different P4R operations that have quite a different approach in terms of where to draw the line and where to draw the sort of fence around the operation. In a strong institutional environment, we can possibly support an entire subsector with a P4R, whereas in a weak environment where we are supporting islands of good governance, we would define the program supported by P4R much more narrowly. And I think that's quite appropriate. And I think you will see some of that in the specific operations. That, I think, should be the guidance for how we define the scope, much more than some of the exclusion criteria that we agree to and we are committed to, but they are putting a very different dimension on how to define the scope that I think is not necessarily in sync with a kind of development effectiveness consideration that you're putting on the table. Bill raised, I think, the spectrum of different operations. I want to make this explicit. I see there is a spectrum of results-based financing. From, on the one hand, the pure cash on delivery, which is a pure incentive scheme, where we would take a very hands-off approach to the way in which a partner is achieving the results and really create a very steep incentive schedule, probably primarily directed at outcomes. That's probably the pure idea of cash on delivery. On the one hand, that is a very risky proposition for the partner, because to make that incentive real, disbursement actually has to be very uncertain, because you want to create an incentive, which means if the results aren't fully there, you actually, you really have to make that a very tough, create a very tough implication, which is much less disbursement. On the one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum are the very programmatic approaches, where I think we are much more involved in the way in which results are produced, very much focused on capacity building, strengthening systems, not just through incentives, but through actually working together and in some case technical assistance to build systems and capacity, and sometimes a much less steep incentive schedule. Because it's really a matter of how you design disbursement-linked indicators, whether you have a sort of very strong incentive effect or a very weak one. You can create much less uncertain disbursement-linked indicators and much more uncertain. And I think that's a spectrum. I think we have predicted, the operations we are seeing are much more on the latter side, meaning programmatic operations, often ongoing programs where results are relatively well known, and where therefore the incentive schedule isn't particularly challenging, so to speak. Yes, if results fail, there is no disbursement, but the disbursement-linked indicators are tied to relatively well-known results, so it's not that much of an uncertainty. On the other hand, a very strong focus on institution and systems building. And I think Bill rightly challenged us to explore the entire spectrum. And I think that's a challenge we would echo and we would like to take on, recognizing that for us it's very hard to be totally hands-off. And this links to some of the other comments that have been made. It is tough for us as a public institution to say we just care about the results and not about how they are produced. Now I take the point that was made that, for example, on the point of on the issue of corruption, that corruption gets in the way of getting results, and therefore, if you have a strong incentive for results, you actually create incentives against corruption. However, I would emphasize as a public institution that isn't quite enough for us. we do need assurances to provide to our shareholders that there are systems in place to deal with corruption if they occur, even if the results occur. I think that is a mandate we have as a public institution, and I think we're willing to respond to that mandate. However, we want to do it in a way that's consistent with the philosophy of this approach. And I think that philosophy is to say the primary focus is on building effective country institutions to deal with corruption. Our tools are much more a backstop to step in if those systems fail, as opposed to the primary respondent to concerns, which I think then links to some of the other comments made on verification and grievance mechanisms, where I think valuable comments and questions were raised. And I want to emphasize, I think the combination of approaches chosen in the operation so far, some external verification, strong reliance, yes, on government reporting systems with external verification. I think we can talk about the credibility of those mechanisms, and that I think is an important challenge. But I really want to emphasize the sort of built-in complaints handling mechanisms, which I think are another tool for reinforcing the national accountability loop, coming back to sort of the local politics. And this is not just for PforR, but I think across our work, we are just recognizing how important it is that our support to partner countries has to strengthen local accountability mechanisms. And therefore, building into programs complaints mechanisms, grievance mechanisms, is becoming ever more important. And we are typically just sort of in a backstop role, where if these mechanisms fail, then we can help and step in to give credibility to those mechanisms rather than to be the primary respondents. Have we reduced transaction focus? Yes, I think the answer is yes. So, for example, in the Nepal Bridges program, we are disbursing against verification of the bridges completed, not against detailed review of the procurement documentation. That is a difference. So we are not actually providing what we call no objections to the award of procurement contracts. We are reviewing the procurement system. We have assessed at the appraisal how do the local governments do the procurement, and we will look at that during implementation. But it's different from the project unit sending to the World Bank a bunch of documents and saying, give us your no objection, review those documents, and give us the go-ahead for sending out the bidding documents, selecting the contractor, and making the payments. So it is actually a very different approach that gets us out of the retail mode and into the systems assessing, system strengthening mode, which is the right mode in these programs which are large, but which have individually small transactions. That comes again back to the difference between big infrastructure projects, where actually the procurement process is an essential part of the program, as opposed to many local bridges or local social expenditures, where there are very many individual expenditures, where our role as the World Bank shouldn't be checking individual invoices, but strengthening the systems in the country that do exactly that. A few more issues maybe to respond to. The indicators chosen as disbursement linked indicators depend on the history of the program, but are very much evolved as the result of the interaction between government and World Bank teams. In the case of established government programs like the Morocco program, those indicators are of course chosen from the results framework of the original program, but are then typically evolving as a result of World Bank involvement. So the starting point has to be the government program and its own results framework. If that's a strong results framework, we should just use those, and we can do that. On the other hand, if that results framework is not particularly strong, there's a dialogue, and there's a question, can we improve that, make the indicators actually more compatible with the incentives of what ultimately the program is meant to achieve. So it's a give and take, but the starting point is the program's own results framework. Impact evaluation and separating the World Bank's contribution. I actually want to push back on this and say this is not what it's about. This is not about identifying what the World Bank contributes to the program, even though that is of course an important question. But I think we are quite consciously saying we are contributing to a government program. That has to have rigorous impact evaluation. but we want to move away from identifying the World Bank dollar in the larger program and saying, what does the World Bank dollar achieve? Especially in those cases where we are financing a modest share of a much larger program. And I think the philosophy has to be the focus is on the government program. And it's about assuring that that program achieves results. Our contribution is to leverage. If we put $1 into a program that spends $10, the objective is with that $1 to raise the quality of the $10 spent, rather than to identify whether our $1 is spent better than the other $9. So I think I would push toward focusing on the program and focusing on the leverage that our contribution ought to achieve. I think it was a good suggestion to transition from output and process indicators over time toward outcome indicators. That's I think something that's alive in the discussion with several teams, but we have to actually follow through on that because it creates immediate support, which is important for, I think, political support, the momentum, and yet it moves us toward more outcome-based financing, which I think we are all seeking to achieve. Yes, there are discussions about hybrid approaches, in particular where capacity building is involved, technical assistance is involved, which is sometimes better supported through our detailed project instrument. So we are discussing a few operations which would combine a more traditional project approach with a program approach. Several of you asked questions related to risks. I touched already on the issue of corruption, which of course for us is one of the significant risks, and I think already sort of made the point we do care about those risks separately from just achieving the outcomes. So I mean, my response is, by using Program for Results, we are willing to take risks in terms of non-achievement of program objectives, in terms of empowering partners to use their own systems, that we wouldn't take on investment lending, and yet we are putting in place and we insist on certain safeguards. And these are our assessments that we're doing ex ante, and in project implementation, we are working with the partners to see that the agreements reached in those assessments on safeguarding against fiduciary risks, social environmental risks are actually being implemented. That is part of our work and part of our risk management. But it's a different approach from our project approach, where we, in a sense, saying here our procedures, and risk management happens by asking the government to suspend its own regulations and adopt our procedures. That's a very, very important difference, but it does not change the importance of managing these risks and our responsibility to shareholders and other stakeholders that we actually manage those risks quite carefully. I think I've touched on many, not on all of them. Maybe I'll stop here for a moment if there are other comments or...
Thank you very much, Joachim. Very comprehensive response. What I'd like to do is to just give our discussants a chance if they want to have any very quick 30-second last thoughts or suggestions as to where we go from here. I'm sure this is not going to be the last event, the last discussion of this. What do you think, Joachim? A few more, probably, and as this goes forward.
I hope not, and I hope you're hosting us again, because I really think we want this learning exchange, and the questions to which I don't have answers are actually showing the value of this discussion.
Thank you. Paul, any last words of wisdom?
Well, it's been a good discussion. Thank you. It's good to see the questions too. And thanks for having us be a part of it. I think the really interesting debate over the next while, 3 types of conditionality, fiduciary conditionality we all pretty much agree on and accept it. The real debate is between policy conditionality, which tells countries exactly how they get to a particular outcome, and outcome conditionality, which just gets agreement on where we, both the donor and the recipient, want to go. We believe that there's enough focus on policy conditionality out there, and the innovation in this is the humility to recognize that policy conditionality, telling responsible leaders how to do stuff, only gets you so far for 2 reasons. I've talked about the leadership problem. It denies them the possibility to learn to lead when you dictate the pathway. But secondly, it doesn't it doesn't recognize that they may actually have better ideas about how to do things. The problem for this initiative is going to be that relatively competent and politically popular leader who says, I can build you a bridge, I can do it for half the price, I can get more local buy-in, and I can outdo whatever quality standards you want for that bridge, and let me do it, and then if I do it, give me money for 5 more bridges. But here's the trick, don't ask me where the money went. Don't ask me how I did it. Don't dictate to me that I go with national or local. Don't tell me I can't take certain types of risks. It's that story that's going to get particularly challenging for us as we start hearing pushback that, you know, corruption is a fact of life. You've got explicit forms of it and less explicit forms of it. I can use it in the ways that we work to get stuff done. It's the outcomes that we actually want by leaders who seek legitimacy and don't play by all our rules that's going to challenge us far more. And I think as long as we're sophisticated about that discussion, because we do have to protect the idea and not have those nasty stories, we'll get the broader dual outcome we want, stronger institutions and actual real results on the ground.
Thank you, Paul. Bill, 30 seconds.
Okay, I applaud Paul's statement about pushing toward outcomes. And I just want to mention that the DFID is also pushing very hard in this direction. They have a program we call results-based aid in Ethiopia and Rwanda they're developing now that are worth looking at. I assume the World Bank's aware of them, and I know the DFID is aware of what the World Bank's doing. But they're paying for children who get to the final year of school. And the focus is really on that outcome, and it's a very worthwhile experiment to look at. And in that regard, I just want to point out, COD aid or pushing toward that outcome payment is not riskier than policy lending or input lending. The risks are different. Paul outlined the risks, the different kinds of risks that the lenders are having to grapple with when they do it. It's different kind of risks, but a lot of benefits for the country. And so I just wanted to say that to say one is more risky or another, it really doesn't make sense. The risk structure that you're looking at, the different kinds of risks that are there, change. And I think that as we get more experience with them, we'll find a lot of the risks we think are there really aren't serious ones.
Thank you very much. Sam.
Thank you. And I'd like to on 2 points. First is on this point that Paul and Bill just said about the freedom to deliver outcomes irrespective of how delivery happens. Let the World Bank not ask. I think that's a really valuable thing to push the World Bank on. But as Joachim said, there's also a lot of push from shareholders and also from other CSOs that we must guard safeguards incredibly strongly. So what I would call for everyone here, Oxfam and others, is coordinate a response and give a very clear message that draws in both safeguards on one hand and the need for outcomes to give a coherent, solid call to the World Bank to deliver. And then they will have more of a mandate to engage with us for that to happen. My second point is very short, just how much I look forward, and I think most of the board at the World Bank looks forward, all of us look forward to seeing further results from this instrument. We had that great slide about early qualitative views of different donors, of different client countries, of how well this is going. Really huge appetite from me and many of us, I'm sure, to see more of that. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've reached the end of the time, and I certainly found it a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, Joachim, for this. And thank you to our discussants and to all the participants. I'm not sure what image stays with me at the end of this, whether it's a booster rocket or a whole bunch of half-built bridges. But certainly something does. And we will write up something on this and in some form or another put it on our website so you have a sort of a record of it. And we look forward to seeing the next installment of this instrument and to see how it goes out. So thank you all very much. Thank you, and thank you, Fadia, and thank you to all the colleagues who've come. Thank you very much.